Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to our show, Solutions. We are going to be discussing real life issues with their solutions, hence the name of the show. We're going to be discussing different topics such as oppression, depression, physical sicknesses, parent-child relations, violence, terrorism, different topics, things that, inshallah, our studio audience and those watching will benefit from. Now, I would like to begin our show by discussing the topic which is seeking knowledge. And now I'd like to begin our quest for seeking knowledge with an ayat from the 39th chapter of the Quran, verse number 9. After saying, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أمن هو قانت آناء الليل ساجدا وقائما يحذر الآخرة ويرجو رحمة ربه قل هل يستوي الذين يعلمون والذين لا يعلمون إنما يتذكر أولو الألباب. And now the translation is one who is obedient to Allah, prostrating himself or standing in prayer during the hours of the night, fearing the hereafter and hoping for mercy from his Lord, equal to one who disbelieves? Say, are those who know equal to those who know not? It is only men of understanding who will remember. It is only men of understanding who will remember. And I'd like to attempt to complement this ayat with the statement of the Messenger of Allah, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, wherein he said, طَالِبُ الْعِلْمِ فَرِيدَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ, that the seeking of knowledge is obligatory upon every Muslim. Every Muslim. Now, let's look at that ayat in light of what the Prophet ﷺ said. We go back to the ayat. It begins by saying, is one who is obedient to Allah. Firstly, we take obedience. If someone doesn't have knowledge, how would he know to be obedient? If he does not know who his Lord is, why should he be obedient? Because he doesn't know, he doesn't understand. So he must have knowledge. Secondly, it makes mention of prostrating himself. The Prophet ﷺ, in response to the topic of salat, he said, خَيْرُ مَوْضُوعٍ, meaning that it is the best of those things which are prescribed. So therefore, how would somebody know the importance of salat if he does not have knowledge? He has to have knowledge. Now, or standing in prayer during the hours of the night. Now, in reference to standing in prayer during the hours of the night, why would somebody bother to get up in the middle of the night, or the last third of the night, I should say? Why should he bother? Except that he knows that his Lord descends to the lowest heaven looking for someone that is making supplication to him so he can grant him what he supplicates. Looking for someone who is seeking forgiveness so that he can forgive him. Why would somebody get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, depending on the time of the year, except that he has knowledge? Without knowledge, he would never know what the great bounty that his Lord has in store for him, except that he were to study, to learn, and have knowledge. Continuing with the ayat, fearing the hereafter. If you don't fear the hereafter, then you're going to do anything it is that you like. But you will not fear the hereafter except that you understand what Jannah is. And you will not understand what Jannah is except that you have knowledge. You will not understand what Nar Jahannam, wa'udhu billahi min dhalik, you will never know what that's about except that you have knowledge. Fearing the hereafter and hoping for the mercy of his Lord Is he like one who disbelieves? Of course, the answer is no. And Allah continues by saying, say, are those who know equal to those who know not? It is only men of understanding who will remember. We need to reflect on this because we need to understand that the Prophet ﷺ always preached to his companions to learn, to benefit, and to seek knowledge, and that's what our episode is about today. I would like to introduce someone to you right now. He's my brother, although he doesn't really look like me, but he's my brother. His name is Musa McGuire. He's a PhD candidate in media studies at the University of Texas. He has a bachelor's from the University of Pennsylvania, and in 2004, he was the recipient of the Fulbright grant for study in Egypt, and he's from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, past all of that, he's a pretty nice guy, or at least he's nice to me. So, at any rate, let us introduce our guest, Musa McGuire. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And jazakallah khair for the warm introduction.
So, first let me ask you a couple of questions. How long have you been Muslim?
I've been Muslim for 7 years, since 1998.
Since 1998. And if you can briefly tell us, how did you accept Islam?
Well, like for many people, it was a long process. But when I was coming of age in high school, I was really obsessed with the problem of racism in American society. And like W.E.B. Du Bois said a century before, I felt that the color line was really the enduring problem of American society, of the 20th century and now even into the 21st century. So it was with this concern for this problem and what seemed in many ways, an insoluble social problem, something that was so deeply ingrained in American society, that I started to look for solutions. And when I was in high school, it was the time when the movie Malcolm X came out, and the story of Malcolm X was really popular, and everybody had X hats, and they even had X shoes.
I saw that.
So I became acquainted with Islam in particular as a solution to this problem of racism. And that was really what first drew me to Islam. And I started to learn about it little by little, and I really respected it. But there was a long time where I felt like, well, I respect it, and I know at least on this one social issue that Islam offers an answer. But, in terms of praying 5 times a day, that seems hard. Fasting, that seems hard. But, over time, it was like the more I learned, the more the truth was tugging at my heart. And the more I started to learn about Tawheed and really the core of Islam, I realized that it was much more than a solution to this single social problem that I had been concerned with. Rather, it was really the solution for everything. And so, by the time shortly after I had graduated from college, I really couldn't resist anymore, and I took Shahada. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. But did you get any problems from your peers, your friends, your family? That now, you went from so-and-so to Musa?
Yeah, well, there's certainly a level of resistance. I mean, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that, the non-Muslims in your family or among your friends are never really going to be completely happy with your decision to be Muslim. And if they were, then really they would accept Islam as well. But of course, there's varying levels of tolerance. Some people in my family have openly really rejected me and said that, you've abandoned your tradition and we really don't want anything to do with you. Others are more tolerant, but they don't quite understand it. Certainly friends I had in the past, I'm probably not as close to anymore because we really, we believe in different things and we live for different things now. But, I try to remain cordial with them. But I think it's a matter of, sometimes it's hard to understand how someone can change like that. But, inshallah, we try to make dawah with these people. And we try not to let, the softness we have in our heart for them from before we were Muslim, prejudice against the fact that they really do need the dawah from us.
Yeah. But those family members who've become tough with you, I mean, how do you deal with them?
Well, I try when I can to communicate with them. Certain family members have really sworn off communication, which makes it a little more difficult. But one thing I think it's important when you're trying to give dawah to your family is to really show it with your actions first, because I think that's what draws their attention. You have to remember that with parents, with other family members, they remember you when you were a little child, when you were completely in need, when they had to change your diapers, when they had to feed you, when you were crying for whatever bothered you. And then suddenly, a few short years later, what seems like a long time to us, but a few short years really, suddenly you're telling them, I have the truth, and you need to accept it. So, the thing that's going to convince them of that is when they see a good behavior, when they see that the heart of the Muslim reformed and the behavior of the Muslim reformed. And in fact, that's actually in some ways a lot harder to really change that about yourself and to change your character in that positive way than it is to just try to explain certain points in the religion. So inshallah, I try to do both. But I think first it has to start with the actions.
Inshallah, inshallah. Now, I'd like to ask you a quick question about Islam in the West, particularly America, but in the West in general. What's the status of Muslim women accepting Islam in the West these days?
These days. Well, we hear a lot of information about the exact statistics about Muslim women. I mean, certainly the stereotypes would have us believe that Islam has nothing attractive to women. But, I know of one survey that was conducted by a magazine in, I think, the Dominican Republic that showed a 3-to-1 ratio of women converting to Islam over men. And other people have cited figures of even 4-to-1 in the United States. Now, I don't know about the exact statistical accuracy of these figures, but what's clear is that, and we all have witnessed this as Muslims in our personal experiences in our masajid, that women really are attracted to Islam, and that women do find a solution and a protection and a comfort in Islam and a peace of mind that really isn't available to them in society.
Mm-hmm. I see. Well, as you know, our topic for today is seeking knowledge, particularly religious knowledge.
Yeah.
So this is our topic. But before we go into that too deeply, I want to ask you a question about, we're finding some young people seeking knowledge by taking classes, meaning Islamic classes, in the various universities around the country. In your opinion, is this a good idea? Is this a good medium for them to learn Islam from the universities?
Well, this is something that I have a little bit of experience in myself. And what I would say is that, there's always knowledge to be gained at the universities. And in a way, we don't want to turn our back on that. But when you're dealing specifically with the topic of Islam, I would say that at best, what you're going to find is going to be bittersweet. Now, the exception to that, and there are exceptions, is when you find a good Muslim instructor who's working within that system and does his best to give you, a really solid curriculum that's going to build your understanding of Islam or your understanding of current events that relate to the Islamic world. But the problem is, for instance, if you study Arabic, sure, you will make progress in Arabic, but the Arabic in universities is structured around a secular curriculum. So, you're learning Fusha, but it's not exactly classical Arabic. It's what they call modern standard Arabic. And in a way, when they're teaching you this, they're teaching you about contemporary political issues, contemporary social issues. You're learning words that allow you to be conversant about current events in the world. But, there's really not an explicit recognition of the fact that the reason we are speaking Arabic now and the reason that Arabic is a global language is because of the Quran and because of Islam.
Do they teach that?
No.
I mean, do they teach, in your opinion, Islam that will help you get to the akhirah?
Well, absolutely, really not. I mean, when you're learning the Arabic, you learn it as a useful tool, and it is capable. But I've always noticed a difference when you learn Arabic, or you get a lesson about an Arabic vocabulary, something in grammar, in an Islamic context. There's always a richness and a sweetness to it that you learn about. The beauty of this language. And when you're learning about it in the university, you learn it as a tool, but it's missing that sweetness because it's explicitly, stripped of that divine quality as much as they can. They try to make it into just any language. And similarly with the Islamic studies classes, one thing we have to remember that some of the shuyukh have talked about the way that there's an ideological warfare going on, ideological warfare against Islam.
In actuality, that's a topic that we're going to touch upon today, inshallah. Now, what I'd like to do is, we went out and we asked the question to some young people. The question is,
which should be the focus of study in our lives? First and foremost, Islamic study or secular study, and why? We got some interesting responses, so let's see what they say.
Okay, let's see.
I think the correct answer should be it should be balanced between both, because if you actually look at the sciences from Islamic point of view, you'll find that a lot of it coincides with Quran and the Sunnah. So I think equal proportions should be given to both, because Islam is not just about believing in something or forcing you to believe something even if you're not convinced with it. So I think the sciences are there for us to believe in Islam more.
In my opinion, I don't think that we should focus on one type of learning or something. We should apply both science and religion, both side by side.
What do you think? Should we apply it, or should they be equal, and should one take precedence over the other?
Well, you know, I think back when Muslims held the stewardship of knowledge, you know, we didn't even have this distinction of secular and religious, because the supplemental knowledge, what we might call the secular knowledge now, grew out of the religious knowledge. You know, I think the problem now is that, you know, we have this separation, but it's essential that we remember that, you know, the crucial knowledge for us is the religious knowledge. Everything else really is a supplement to that. And I think, you know, we need to try to organize ourselves around that principle.
Inshallah, inshallah. Well, we're going to ask that same question to our next guest, and we'll get a little bit more insight, inshallah. So, we'll be back in just a few short minutes with our next guest. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
You have questions that bother you. What about issues of concern to you? Would you like to share things on your mind with us? Are you interested in solutions based on an Islamic perspective? Please join me live in Meet Your Advisor every Friday at 9 p.m. Mecca time, here on Huda TV.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and we are back. We now would like to introduce our second guest. He studied in Mecca in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for 12 years, and he's been giving dawah, countless khutbahs, religious talks, and so on and so forth, both inside of the States, outside of the States, and everywhere in between. So I'd like to introduce my other brother, who also doesn't look like me, but he's still my brother also. His name is Ammar Emanet. Ahlan wa sahlan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And it's good to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. You've been monitoring what we've been discussing so far. We just saw some responses from some people who think that secular knowledge and religious knowledge is equal and should be learned on equal terms. Do you agree with that statement or not?
Well, I think theoretically, probably most people wouldn't dispute that. But practically, I would have to disagree, because the problem isn't a lack of study of secular knowledge, but the problem is a lack of religious understanding. If you look at the Muslim world in the last 150 years, the Muslim world has been sending students abroad to learn the knowledge of the West since the Ottoman times. Islamic universities in the Islamic world produce tens of thousands of students every year. In the United States, every university has a full load of students from every part of the Muslim world. Probably every hospital in the country has doctors on staff from the various parts of the Islamic world. So Muslims put in just as much an effort in that area as anyone else. That's not the problem that I see in the Islamic world. It's that there's a huge corruption that drains away the energies that are put in by the Muslim peoples in areas of education, and that's because of the lack of a foundation in religious teaching, ethics, moral conduct, which destroys the productive efforts that the Muslim people put into education. So I think that, the problem isn't that Muslims aren't interested in science and mathematics, they all are. But the efforts prove fruitless.
So, do you see a direct correlation between stagnation in certain areas where there are Muslims because of a lack of religious knowledge, or because of a lack of secular knowledge, or both?
Well, when you go back to the root of it, religious knowledge stagnated first, and that caused a delay in technological scientific development. And the religious stagnation caused moral decay throughout the society, spread of corruption, and that has destroyed the infrastructure of society. So you can't just take, there's not a lack of information or data, but how you use it. If there's not a system where you can productively use knowledge, then you'll get to the situation we're in today. So, of course, the fundamental problem is religious knowledge. A misunderstanding of what Islam is and a misunderstanding of what Islamic knowledge or fiqh knowledge is. And if you solve that problem, then I believe every other problem is solved by, in course of time.
One of the things that I've dealt with being a student in not so much the sciences and mathematics, but in humanities and the social sciences, is that there's a lot of important knowledge there in these fields, and at the same time there's a lot of ideologies competing for attention. And when you bring an Islamic ideology to the table, you're generally in a very lonely position. And do you have any thoughts on how Muslims should go about studying in these fields?
Well, usually when people say ideology, they mean search for political solutions, and people are cynical all over the board in that area because of a century of failure in finding political solutions. And so the person who can devote themselves has to study basic Islamic sciences and fields of knowledge and do advanced research if they can get to that point to do advanced research. The problem is that people misunderstand what Islamic knowledge is, and they think that fiqh, for example, is learning ahkam, salat, wudu, tahara, the different laws, and of course every Muslim child has to learn those things. But fiqh, as the Prophet ﷺ said, مَن يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. If Allah desires good for anyone, He grants them the understanding of religion. That means that, understood from that hadith, that the solution for every problem is in religious knowledge. That any good that Allah wants for any person or group of people, it comes by way of religious knowledge. And by contrast, if Allah does not desire good for a certain individual or group, then He does not grant them that knowledge. So understanding fiqh from the point of view of the gateway of all good in this life and in the hereafter.
So, understanding the importance of religious knowledge, what would you recommend for the average person living in the West that perhaps doesn't have the opportunity to go abroad to seek knowledge? How would you say, or what type of curriculum, briefly, could you give in terms of seeking knowledge? How can the average person in Milwaukee or New York or Florida or Colorado seek knowledge?
Well, you have to seek knowledge from those people who possess it. It takes dedication, it takes time and patience and sacrifice, and unfortunately a lot of our brothers are not willing to commit to that, at least not for a long term. That being said, the ones who are sincere in seeking knowledge often have a difficulty of finding people to help them. There aren't the proper books and literature in English, for example, to help most people beyond a certain level. Hadiths have been translated, Quran have been translated, but actually you can't approach those things and deduce knowledge from them unless you have the tools, the usul, or the principles, foundation principles of Islamic knowledge. you need to get those principles. And the only way you can do that these days is to go to an institution or to a sheikh who is learned in that area, who can, impart them to you. But you need the tools first before you approach the data. And unfortunately, if you just translate some knowledge into the language, that doesn't give them the tools to use that knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say are the bare necessities? Because what I'm trying to drive at here is that we have viewers who unfortunately at this time don't have the ability to go to a foreign country where they can study. What advice do you have for them?
Every Muslim, it doesn't matter where they're at, has certain knowledge which is, farda'in knowledge, which every Muslim man and woman is required to know. They have to know their Lord, their God, His attributes. They have to know the basic obligations of a Muslim. You know probably very well that you can't know ibadah or worship is acceptable without understanding the purpose of it, the meaning of what you're doing. You need to know what the kalimat al-shahada means. Otherwise, you pronounce it in vain. You need to understand your salat, zakat, hajj, sawm. You need to know family structure, the rights and responsibilities of the husband and wife. Unfortunately, this is a cause of endless strife in our community. You need to know Islamic guidance for raising a family, doing your business, whatever business somebody's in. They need to know what Islam says about that business and how to conduct it.
Would you say that the internet is a reliable medium? As you know, a lot of brothers and sisters, they're going straight to the internet to try to learn their religion, chat rooms and such like that. Is that a reliable medium for learning Islam?
Well, the problem is the internet contains everything. It's a total free market, and it contains valuable kernels of knowledge, and it contains a lot of things that will mislead you. It contains things which are totally antithetical to Islam. My advice is that people find someone who is more knowledgeable than themselves, who they feel is sincere, who has a religious background, and take their advice before they go and learn from different sources. And at least if you are on sort of your own free quest for knowledge, at least don't accept something until you have compared it with what is available to you from the Quran, from the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and compare what you get from different sources. And perhaps that way you can be saved the trouble of being committed or committing yourself to a set of ideas, and then it turns out in the future that those ideas were not authentic Islam.
Well, Musa and I discussed just before you came out about the huge influx of women accepting Islam. Do you have any particular advice for females who are accepting Islam, whose husbands may or may not have the ability to teach them? Do you have any advice for them who want to seek knowledge?
Well, unfortunately, in our community in general, women are bearing the greater burden in our society than the Muslim men. They're bearing a burden of being very distinctive in the society. In fact, they're vulnerable to assault, and within the society, women don't get the support they need in general. As far as religious knowledge, there are several institutes in America that do correspondence work by the internet, which, for example, you have the American Open University, which has authentic Islamic information. Those things cost money. They do have tuition, but they are authentic sources of Islamic knowledge. There's the Juma magazine, for example, which is one of other sources. I don't want to just single out that one, but it's a source of knowledge that people can have from the privacy of their own homes.
Like these days, we're seeing a lot of, or at least on some levels, infighting between different groups, this group and that group. What does a lack of Islamic solid foundation play? What part does that play in this infighting that we're seeing today,
No doubt
in extremism?
No doubt it's a major factor. Of course, the Prophet ﷺ predicted that Muslims would divide and they would fight each other. They would divide into various groups. But unfortunately, that's escalating, and it's mostly due to a lack of knowledge. People will fight their brothers whom they should love and be united with, and take, for example, the Muhajirin and Ansar, the people of Makkah who emigrated to Medina, and how they were welcomed and how they united despite their strong differences in being from different tribes from different parts of the country. They should take that as an example. Unfortunately, what they do is divide over secondary matters and ignore the primary matter, which is the unity of the Islamic Ummah, which should be paramount. And instead, they're not fighting over essential matters, basic matters of the religion, but they're fighting over secondary matters. Who prays in what way, or who likes what sheikh and who likes another one, and things which are not of importance. So definitely the lack of knowledge is that they don't have priorities. Islamic knowledge, all knowledge isn't equal. All the ahkam or Islamic laws aren't equal. There are priorities. And you stress the first one first and second one second. That's the wisdom that Islam was revealed gradually. The Quran came down gradually and was implemented over time. But people are in a hurry. They want everything now. If I change my mind about something, then I try to force everybody around me to agree with my opinion, or else I divorce myself from their fellowship, which of course is not allowed in Islam for us to separate ourselves from our brothers.
I think, as you said earlier, that knowledge does require a lot of sacrifice. And I know from personal experience with trying to negotiate a lot of these issues myself, both the internet and trying to deal with different groups, is that I think sometimes it really is just the easy way out to go after one single opinion and sort of hang yourself on that. And then you sort of ended the process for yourself, the process of learning and seeking and really making sacrifice or traveling or doing what you need to do to really gain knowledge, and you've given yourself kind of the fast food approach almost.
If you take the average person, the average Muslim who doesn't have a lot of knowledge, and he's being called from this side by this group, this side from that group, and he doesn't have enough knowledge to be able to decide or make an intelligent decision. Should I be with this group? Should I be with that group or these people? Do you have any advice for someone who's struggling with that?
Yeah, I don't believe there's any evidence that one needs to join any particular group, and especially groups that demand loyalty from their followers. I think one would be very hesitant to join groups like that, especially groups that insist on a bay'ah or oath of allegiance. There's no bay'ah to anybody in our world other than if there were a head of state, and there's no such bay'ah to a head of any religious group. And that's a very dangerous thing where people decide that they're going to blindly follow a particular leader. But they should keep their minds open, learn from the various groups, learn from the sources, and use their mind to make their decision and not become a follower. If you could spend your life following the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, you would have done very well. You don't need to look for another leader. And at this time, there aren't people who deserve your blind obedience, to tell you the truth. And those people who are claiming it are most likely not in the right.
Well, we're going to continue our discussion, inshallah, God willing. But first, we're going to take a brief break, and we're going to come back with our guests, Ammar and Manette. Wa jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
da
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And we are back with our program Solutions, and we are discussing seeking knowledge. As we discussed earlier, you can't seek knowledge unless you put the time into it. So we went out and we asked a question to some of the people. And we got some interesting responses. We don't have time for a lot of responses, but the question that I asked is this. How many hours a week do you devote to your college studies? And this is the response that we received.
I love graphics, and I intend to be a graphics designer. So yeah, I spend lots of times, and really lots of times, like maybe 5 to 7 hours a day, trying to get, looking at fine pieces of art, looking at, trying to get inspired by some people that I really respect. So yeah, I think I spend lots of times trying to, acquire some experience and knowledge in what I really want to do.
Okay. He said that he spends about 5 to 7 hours a day seeking knowledge in his secular field. Then I counted and I asked the question, how many hours a week do you devote to Islamic studies? And this is the response that we received.
Islamic studies? Yeah. I don't, to be honest with you, I don't really have a devoted number of hours, or I devote times for Islamic studies. But if it comes by chance that I found that something is really interesting about Islam, or I go into some controversial topic, I devote some times for that in order to, just for the sake of myself, not to prove to anyone anything, just for the sake of myself, for the sake of having knowledge about my religion.
Unfortunately, this is the type of lack of a set program that you might find amongst a lot of the people. What are your comments on that?
My comments are that ambition in your profession is a good thing. That's ambition in this world, but you also need ambition for the next world, the permanent world, the eternal world. And so you need to devote a similar sort of effort to your religious knowledge. That's obviously painfully obvious that that's the typical answer that you're going to get. If you have a peasant living in a village, a very poor person in very hard circumstances, barely surviving, you would excuse that kind of thing. But when you have people who are very ambitious and hardworking, and yet they are totally negligent of religion, I think that's a good clue about what our problem is. They don't understand that the moral and ethical basis of Islamic studies is what brings success in any career that they're in this life as well as in the next life.
Musa, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think I speak from the experience of somebody who's trying to make a transformation from that kind of mentality, taking knowledge more lightly than it should be taken, to really putting myself on the path of proper path towards knowledge. And all I can say is that it's very easy to lull yourself into a sense that you know enough, or that you have a lot of knowledge. You think, I've read a few books, I can be conversant on a few topics. I know that there are maybe several different opinions on a certain fiqh or certain legal issue. But when you have that experience of actually sitting down with somebody and studying a book of hadith, and it takes you 2 or 3 hours to go through one hadith or 2 hadith, you realize the vastness of knowledge that is, that you don't have access to at that point. But alhamdulillah, having those kind of experiences puts the taste in your mouth, and it really is a sweet taste. Alhamdulillah.
Going back some years ago, when I began to study Islam, really began to study Arabic and the Quran, that's when you begin to realize that the more you learn, the more you know that you don't know anything. So, I think we all pretty much experienced that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What we're going to do now is we're going to open up the floor just a little bit, and we're going to go to our audience and see if we can get some questions going on. I think we have a question here.
Yeah, I would like to know what type of inspiration can we gain from the stories of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in respect to seeking knowledge?
That's me. Okay.
We'll direct that to you.
Well, I think that's wonderful. You know, the Sahaba were a generation of people who are exemplary in every aspect of their lives. The important lesson to derive is how they started with nothing in absolutely a lost cause. If you were to examine from any historical point of view, they were promised something in the future, and they had faith in the success of Islam, but there was no reason for anybody to ever suspect that that would be the case, who was looking at it outside. And the Sahaba were people who were transformed in one lifetime, and that has never happened, I don't think, historically of any other civilization, where a whole country really was transformed in a decade or two, from barbarism and maybe a drifting life with no meaning to a beautiful example that everybody will look at from 1,000 years, 2,000 years later. People will still be looking at them as an example. People who had little resources but dedication and hard work, devotion.
The tragic thing about it as well is that, we talked earlier about the ideological warfare. And, very often that warfare is waged not on the Quran or on the Prophet ﷺ himself, but on the Sahaba. And when you don't have knowledge of these people, when you only know their names as references to who did what or what you're allowed to do, and you don't realize the character of these people, you're not immediately on guard against these attacks. But when you do have that knowledge of the Sahaba and their character, it's an automatic shield. From this angle of attack, you'll dismiss it right away, because these people are attacking people who are far better than them and far better than us.
Okay, we have another question from a brother in the second row. Fadl.
What should we concentrate our studies on first, the Quran or the Arabic language?
It's not a first. You need both of them. You need both simultaneously as much as possible. Of course, you can use translations of the Quran, tafsir or books of interpretation of the Quran to guide you, but you're getting all of your knowledge secondhand without Arabic language. So, of course, every Muslim starting out needs to study in their own language. As an adult, you can't wait until years later you have Arabic and then you begin studying Quran. You can study from whatever is translated into your language and begin a program of Arabic language. And as an adult, of course, as a child, you can wait. You can start learning the language first and memorize Quran, and later on learn, gradually learn. But when you're an adult, you need to know answers to your problems now. And so you need to go to what is translated. And so, of course, begin an Arabic study program, but you have to realize that takes years to produce results. It would take you several years till you would even be able to begin to understand the tafsir, for example, in Arabic language.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We have another question right here.
Yes, if you would, what are some of the characteristics that we should look for in a qualified Islamic studies teacher?
Well, it would be nice if everyone had the luxury of choosing their teacher based on the praiseworthy characteristics of that person. Ideally, you're looking for a person who is an example of what he is teaching, that he lives the words that he's reading and teaching you, that he's patient, of course, knowledgeable, but is an example of what is produced by Islamic studies, that is an ethical, moral reflection of the best that Islam has to offer. That way he's an inspiration to you to increase your iman or your faith, to strengthen your faith. You can get data out of a machine, but the machine can't inspire you to live by that information. But human beings do. That's why Allah sent human messengers. He didn't send angels or divine beings as messengers to humanity. He sent human beings who could exemplify it. So, of course, you want to look for somebody who lives what his message is.
Yes. Okay. We have another question here.
Yes, my question is, what books would you recommend for study so as to solidify our Islamic foundation?
Alhamdulillah, in the English language, there's a growing body of literature that has been translated into English, much more than we had, for example, 20 years ago, when there was really a paucity of things available with, from any authentic point of view. We have writers who are writing books, especially for English speakers, who have a good, sound basis of aqidah. You need to work on the foundation, Islamic beliefs, and the correct interpretation of the Quran. The tafsir of Ibn Kathir is translated into English, which will be a good guideline for anybody. It's in several volumes. It's not an easy book, but it's full of things that would be of interest to every different level of society. You need to, of course, what is lacking are some basic books which describe the fiqh as a process for making decisions regarding every issue that would come up in any area of life. Instead, the books are very narrow, dealing with how to perform religious rituals, basically, while actually Islamic knowledge deals with every kind of question that anybody would ever have. And that is the real knowledge that still we don't have anything for people in English in that kind of an area. It's a decision-making process.
Before we go to our next question, I'd like to ask you a question about females, of course, represent at least or more than half of the ummah. But I don't see a lot of books that are written by females.
Yeah.
I mean, can you give us a little bit of, shed a little bit of light on why we're seeing such a lack of participation from females in the academic field concerning Islam?
Well, historically there have always been female scholars in Islamic history from the time of the Sahaba. For example, Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There were famous Muslim women scholars of hadith in all the early generations. All the great muhaddithin, or specialists in the hadith literature, all of them learned from at least one woman teacher in their lifetime. But of course, in the last few generations, that has decreased. But I have seen some things written by some active women, and inshallah that will happen more in the future. But usually what you see are things written by men about, the ideal Muslim woman, how she should behave. And very seldom is that from the woman's point of view. There have been a couple of things which have been collaborative efforts, and there have been women on those, participating in those efforts. But I can't tell you except that in our society that we're familiar with in the West, the efforts are still a tiny percentage of the population. So it's not really those people who are actually actively producing things for the Islamic market don't really represent the population. They're a few individuals. It's not an organized effort. So it's not because somebody has organized himself to keep women out. It's just that some women haven't taken the initiative, perhaps, that will in the future, inshallah, if Allah guides them to contribute. But of course, in Islam, women have the right to pursue knowledge to any degree and to write.
So you really think that they should be more assertive concerning their academic studies and doing books for women issues?
Well, for example, there are women who have completed, to a certain degree, advanced Islamic studies, for example, in the Arab countries, but then they haven't returned back to America, or they haven't gotten active because of probably I'm assuming because of their family obligations. They have not come back and produce something. Most Muslim women are more active privately than publicly as Muslim men are. But of course, writing, translating, those kinds of research, those are things that a woman could easily do from the privacy of her own home. It just hasn't happened yet because there are actually only a handful of people who are, for example, in America or Canada or in England who are actually authoring books in English anyway. So they're not a representative sample of the population.
I see. Well, we have time for just one more question in the second row.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
What advice can you offer to someone who's young and considering getting married, but at the same time want to go and seek knowledge?
Well, I don't think those are contradictory at all. But the wife has to be very patient with you. You have to kind of spell everything out in advance. We're going to live in poverty for quite a few years, and find a wife who's willing to do that. And yeah, I was married at a very young age, and we went together. We went to Mecca, and we spent many years there, and we shared that goal. If the wife doesn't share that goal, though, it's going to be a trying experience for both. And so I advise that you make it clear what your goals, what your intentions are, because of course we're living in a society that is highly materialistic and values displays of wealth. And so even many Muslim women feel something negative if they are not able to compete with the other women of the society in their consumption of wealth. And that's unfortunately the fact of life. And so you have to make sure beforehand that you both agree that knowledge comes first, and material things can be delayed at least for a few years.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. And I'd like to thank our guest, Ammar Emanet, and also Musa McGuire. Although Musa McGuire, he lives here. Yeah. So, and we're going to be discussing many, many topics together, inshallah, in the future and our next program. So I would like to thank you all for joining us, and jazakumullah li kulli khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Do